Two quickies here. Men's retreat, guys. Some of you are joining us at Manuka next week. How about we meet by the front doors right after the postlude, and we'll talk about carpooling. And also, just one shout out to folks at Central Point Presbyterian. They're joining us again through Facebook Live, so they're with us. We've got a couple of churches together, which is so Presbyterian. It's just fabulous. So welcome, folks. Glad to have you with us. If you've ever been to Central Point, they have a wonderful church. It's kind of like ours. It has this open feeling and real fresh. So glad to have you with us. Dear God, thank you for this crazy text from the Bible. What in the world were you thinking? Help us with our thinking. Amen. Have you ever been fired from a job? Don't raise your hand. If you did, do you remember that it was coming? Did you see it coming? And did you have that queasy feeling in your stomach? You know, they're going to come in and tell me to pack my stuff and leave. Maybe even have someone escort me off the building's property. Humiliating, right? Maybe it wasn't a wrongful termination. Maybe you were young and not as mature as you are now. There's that panic that sets in. What am I going to do now? Because my next possible employer is probably going to call this employer and ask for a reference. How am I going to live? How am I going to pay my bills? Will I have to move back in with my folks? And if you felt that, experienced that, the parable today may sound kind of familiar, at least at the outset. Jesus is telling a parable, which is, a little window on real life, about the guy who's getting fired and who deserved it and who ends up getting congratulated by the fellow who fires him for swindling him out of a lot of money before the whole thing comes down completely. It's a wild story, comes from a crazy book. I wouldn't read it if I were you. I mean, look, Jesus praises a swindler for his cleverness and then draws for us no moral lesson about this graft. Some Christians, in the 2nd century found the story too disturbing to take seriously, and they denied it was from Jesus. There must have been a mistake. Others, like the Roman Emperor Julian, said, it's Jesus, all right, and it shows that far from being a god, Jesus is merely a man, and not a very worthy man at that. So let's review this important story. Once upon a time, Jesus said there was a rich man who had a steward, a kind of business manager, and charges were brought to the man that this steward was wasting the owner's goods. The problem here sounds like, a simple personnel issue, right? Malfeasance in the workplace. The steward will need to be let go. It just seems that simple. But complications set in when the steward is allowed a few extra days to audit the books and submit a financial statement. So between Friday and Monday, when the accounts are due, the steward goes around to all the rich man's debtors and cooks the books. He marks down a percentage of all the debt owed by each and thereby ingratiates himself with all the people to whom he'd be looking for help once he is fired. How much do you owe my master, he asks one. 100 measures of oil. All right, take your bill, write down 50. How much do you owe, he asks another. 100 measures of wheat, comes the answer. Hurry, take your bill and just write down 80. Barbara Brown Taylor says, it's hard to tell whether the steward was cutting out his markup, eliminating the interest charges, or just stealing from his master by lowering the debt. Any way you look at it, I think it's reasonable in the light of the economy of this parable to view the steward in the most negative way. So, by the end of the day, he has lined his pockets and the pockets of his master's debtors at the rich man's expense. Quote, and the master congratulated him on being so resourceful. Well, the charming rascal is a favorite literary type, right? There's something in all of us that wants to see a gifted swindler get away with mayhem once in a while. Hollywood's made a mint on this character. Think of Paul Newman and Robert Redford in The Sting, or Catch Me If You Can with Leonardo Cappuccino. You remember that one? DiCaprio. Leonardo DiCaprio playing the real-life crook Frank W. Abagnale, who flew for Pan Am, practiced law for 5 years in Louisiana as an assistant state attorney, masqueraded as a pediatrician in Georgia, and was a very popular sociology professor at BYU. You can pull anything off on BYU, right? And he didn't ever graduate from high school. He was perhaps the most successful con man in history and ended up spending 5 years in the federal penitentiary. He was released when he agreed to advise the government on how to uncover frauds and forgers. Who better than him? He began his 1981 autobiography with the following story from his short career as a Pan Am pilot. "Good morning, Captain," the cashier said to me. The markings on my uniform identified me as a first officer, a co-pilot, but the French are like that. They tend to overestimate everything. I signed the hotel bill. She slid across the counter, started to turn away, and then wheeled back, taking a payroll check from my inside pocket. "Oh, can you cash this for me? Your Paris nightlife nearly wiped me out, and it'll be another week before I'm home." I smiled ruefully. She picked up the forged Pan Am World Airways check and looked at the amount. "I'm sure we can, Captain, but I must get the manager to approve an amount this large." She stepped into an office behind me and was back in a moment, displaying a pleased smile. She handed me the check to endorse. "I assume you want American dollars," she said, and without waiting for a reply, she counted out $786.73. I pushed back two $50 bills. "I'd appreciate it if you would take care of the necessary people since I was so careless," I said, smiling. She beamed. "Of course, Captain, you are so kind. Please come back." Which just goes to show you that no con man in or out of the Bible can work all alone. That's why the Department of Justice is subpoenaing dozens of Donald Trump's subordinates and corralling all of their cell phones, right? So, in Jesus' parable, when the landowner discovers what's happened, he finds himself in a terrific bind. He can jail the dishonest steward and reverse the damage done to himself. But the problem is there is already a celebration going on in town about this whole thing. His tenant farmers are all down at McMenamin's eating tater tots and washing them down with pints of India Pale Ale to toast his generosity. And the steward's kindness, too. He can tell them it's a mistake, but that means he will end up paying for it big time with their everlasting resentment, or he can act as if it was his idea in the first place to do this. This is just what he decides to do. He shows unusual mercy, amazing grace, and then commends the steward for his cleverness. Unbelievable, or maybe not. Maybe the steward knew all along what would happen if his master were backed into that kind of a corner. Maybe he knew that his master, when push came to shove, would be gracious, was gracious down to his toes when he knew what the score was. Maybe that's one of the main points of the parable, but we don't know for sure. It's a bit of a mystery. And when Luke reports an intriguing saying of Jesus, he picked up somewhere, probably in a list of collected sayings of Jesus that we know were making the rounds in that day. He said, "No servant can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and," what was that other word? Mammon. Mammon. Mammon was a great biblical word. It's money, but you know, it's more than money. It's the mystique of money. It's the essence of wealth with a capital W. It's Las Vegas. It's Club Med. It's a week of daily golf at Pebble Beach and all that goes with that. It's the hubris of a company that names an automobile Infinity. It's Halliburton getting all the contracts in Iraq, all of them, without having to bid on any one, and nobody really complaining about it. It's the smell of a magazine like Vanity Fair, and the fact that you can't tell the articles from the ads in that magazine, which is the whole freaking point. It's the new Leave or Live, they haven't figured out how to pronounce it yet, the new Leave professional golf tour, backed by Saudi billionaires who pay big-name golfers huge sums just to show up in an effort to change the Saudi image from being murdering thugs, which they are, to instead being sportsmen. It's what Osama bin Laden hated so much, because having come from a filthy rich Saudi family, he had it, and then he didn't have it anymore. So he both wanted it and despised it at the same time. Mammon is whatever shapes your dreams. It's whatever you expect to save you. Favorite English professor of mine in college, Phil Eaton, was brought up dripping with money. In college, he grew a beard and discovered the writings of Henry David Thoreau, and he became a convert to the anti-mammon movement going around in the 1960s. You know, in 1840, Henry David Thoreau, had gone to live in a tiny cabin overlooking Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. He gave up comfortable digs and took up a poor man's life, confounding his friends and family who could not understand. And his defense was a book he simply called Walden. And in it he says, quote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach me, and not when I came to die discover that I had not lived." Living deliberately is, of course, all about choosing God and not mammon, which is always busy choosing us. So my friend Phil wrote his doctor's thesis on Walden, and I remember speaking with him in 1980. He'd been a full professor by then for 10 years, and his father was still asking him when he was going to get a real job. In fact, that year his dad asked him if he could get him started in the newest surefire money-making enterprise of the day, which was, 1980, which was storage units. Storage units, acres and acres, square miles of storage units. Phil realized immediately it was the complete antithesis of all he had chosen for himself. See, the thing about mammon isn't just the stuff that comprises it, it's having to store it, right? Mammon isn't just having a dozen vintage Ford Mustangs. It's also, where you put them. It's endless shelving and gymnasium-sized walk-in closets and 20-car garages and storing the Godzilla bytes of data you need for keeping the photographs and videos to itemize all those things for insurance purposes. My mammon amounts to books. Every time I move, I have parted with hundreds, I mean it, hundreds of books. And then in a couple of years, I find I've replaced them all. Listen again to how Jesus puts this. You cannot serve two masters, God and mammon. You see, it's not that mammon is bad. Jesus has been consistently misunderstood on this point. He did not condemn wealth in itself or ambition. He told one wealthy young man to sell all he had and give it to the poor, but that was a particular prescription for that particular human being, not a universal call or model. What Jesus is saying is that wealth or any form of mammon doesn't work if we're looking to it for our ultimate fulfillment. It won't work in that case and never has, but people try and try until, it eventually kills them or kills their spirit. Frank Abagnale himself said that all the stuff he collected with the millions he gathered in his elaborate frauds just led to elaborate worrying. So, Whatever you're banking on as the fulfillment of all your dreams, be it an antique automobile, or your reputation, even your children, it's still the same. It's still the same. If you don't see it and everything you have as given to you temporarily by God, it will collapse on itself of its own weight. So one of the basic insights in the wisdom of Jesus is that if you try to squeeze something infinite out of something finite, you will not only be unsuccessful and frustrated, you will very likely squeeze the life out of the thing you love as well. So the final truth of the whole mammon business is that you and I only deeply enjoy what we don't ultimately need. Let me say that again. You and I only deeply enjoy what we don't ultimately need. Perhaps you saw the following in this week's news. I'll share the version that came from the New York Times. Quote, a half-century after founding the outdoor apparel maker Patagonia, Yvon Chouinard, the eccentric rock climber who became a reluctant billionaire with his unconventional spin on capitalism, has given his company away. Rather than selling the company or taking it public, Mr. Chouinard, his wife, and 2 adult children have transferred their ownership of Patagonia, valued at about $3 billion, to a specially designed trust and a nonprofit organization. They were created to preserve the company's independence and ensure that all of its profits, some $100 million a year, are used to combat climate change and protect undeveloped land around the globe. Now, because the Chouinards donated their gifts to a trust, this is the kicker, the family will pay an additional $17.5 million in taxes on the gift. So you heard that right. This is the kicker here. No one's ever done this quite this way. Not only are they not getting a huge tax break, it's costing them $17.5 million in taxes to give Patagonia away. Quote, hopefully this will influence a new form of capitalism that doesn't end up with a few rich people and a bunch of poor people, Mr. Chouinard said in an interview. Quote, we are going to give away the maximum amount of money to people who are actively working on saving this planet. The Times piece continues. In some ways, the forfeiture of Patagonia is not terribly surprising coming from Mr. Chouinard. As a pioneering rock climber in California's Yosemite Valley in the 1960s, Mr. Chouinard lived out of his car and ate damaged cans of cat food that he bought for 5 cents apiece. Even today, he wears raggedy old clothes and drives a beat-up Subaru and splits his time between modest homes in Ventura and Jackson, Wyoming. Mr. Chouinard does not own a computer or a cell phone. And he says, I feel a big relief that I have put my life in order. So, Yvon Chouinard didn't let being a billionaire ultimately define his life. Nor, I imagine, did he let having to eat cat food at 5 cents a can so he could pursue his passion of rock climbing define his life either, right? All along his journey, up and down, he listened to the quiet inner voice that we all have. It's the one that can easily become inaudible if we listen instead to what the world is telling us. Make no mistake, money or mammon will change us if we let it, if we don't stay on top of it. Whether we have a ton of it or are hopelessly in debt, either way, it can define you. The secret is to understand the insidiousness of money and the incessant background noise that it makes in our lives. So only being aware of this can we then hear our own signature heartbeat and be who the Creator called us to truly be at our heart. Crazy parable, but incredibly true. Amen.